We heard last week from four dads. Well, one was a granddad actually, but four dads, and about their joy and maybe their struggles of being a dad. And however, the legacy that they also seek to leave. And so we're spending a couple of weeks on leaving a legacy. And it's not just about being a dad, it's about being maybe a dad or a mum or a grandparent, or just in any sort of friendship or relationship that we have. Like Alison's not leaving, but she's finishing up in her role, and many of us can testify to her influence on us and the legacy that she is continuing to leave, and it's just a joy. You might like to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 18. We just want to read a few verses and spend a few minutes just chatting about someone. 2 Samuel chapter 18. This is heading towards, a bit of the latter end of King David. David mustered the men who are with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under the command of Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, "I myself must surely march out with you." But the men said, "You must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. You are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better for you to give us support from the city." The king answered, "I will do whatever seems best to you." And so the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. And the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Be gentle with this young man Absalom for my sake." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. What do we see? We see this man David, and David has left an incredible legacy. We had the privilege of going to Jerusalem a number of years ago, and we went to, I think they call it like the tomb of David. And the ladies have to go on one side and the men on the other side, and there's certainly a number of Orthodox Jews there in constant prayer beside this big casket thing. Like, such is the legacy of this man that they would still visit. And we know there's lots of people where that happens. Well, some. But like part of the city. And we call the whole lot of Jerusalem the city of David. But it was certainly really just part of it. But we call the city of David. Like Jerusalem, it's like the capital of, at least two religions, and a third one wants to be part of it as well. But the city of David. And we think of our modern state of Israel, and certainly even before it formed, we have what's prominent on their flag, of course, is the Star of David. Like, we see the legacy that this man has had on history, and not just Jewish history. We see also in the scriptures, not only do we have the city of David and the Star of David, but the scriptures in the Old Testament and the New remind us that the Messiah would come from the line of David. Like, from his offspring, there would be offspring, and there would be the Messiah. We know that before that passage was read, and before he was officially king, it's God said he is a man after my own heart. Like, he's a man who left a legacy. We see too like he ruled his nation for 40 years. So the nation of Israel as king, and during that time of he and his son Solomon was regarded as like the golden years of Israel, because they prospered and they expanded to the north, the east, the south. Couldn't go far west, that was the Mediterranean, but they expanded their territory and they prospered. We see he built a massive army, of course, as part of that, and the army was there, and he had a personal army as well of 500 top SAS troops. We see he was, not only was he able to expand his territory and build a golden age kingdom where many prospered, he wasn't just a great army leader, but he was able to hold on to the boundaries of his kingdom. He was a great statesman as well. So here we have this man who left a legacy. And in the midst of all that, he found time to write music and song. And we see in our scriptures at least, I think it's about 73 psalms. One of these people studying will correct me. I think at least 73 psalms that were written by David, where he learned the instruments and sang the songs. And we have a lot of it here in the scriptures. He left a legacy. A great man who left a great legacy. And yet as you read the story of David, you see the legacy that he left, however, on his family was not so positive. Like, we might regard him as a great person in many ways, but when we look at his family, we see a lot of struggle. You know, he got to his roughly, I think, mid-40s, and his eyes strayed to the lady on the rooftop over the road, and decided that she looked great and that he needed her, and so he lured her, Bathsheba, and committed adultery. Like, if that wasn't complicated enough, Bathsheba became pregnant. And so he had her husband come back to town, was seeking to hide the pregnancy, but that didn't really work, so things went from bad to worse, and he had her husband Uriah, in effect, killed on the battlefield. A bit of a low point, clearly, in his life and his personal life. And this impacted the family, of course. He had lots of kids, but impacted the family. One of them was a son called Amnon. Amnon had, maybe a bit like his dad, a bit of a wandering eye, and he saw his half-sister Tamar and took a fancy to Tamar. And it turns out that he lured Tamar to his apartment and raped her and discarded her. And she fell into great depression, seemingly as a result. Well, there was another son, that was Amnon. There was another son, Absalom, and Absalom was angry and furious about what had happened to his sister. And he was angry and furious towards Amnon and plotted the downfall of Amnon. And 2 years later, he held a feast for Amnon. And at that feast, he had Amnon killed. Like revenge for what happened to his sister. Where was David? Well, it seems like David didn't have a lot of credibility. Like, you couldn't say, well, this is bad, don't do this, Amnon, this is all terrible. He didn't have a good track record personally, and so seemingly perhaps didn't have great credibility with his sons. Absalom not only was angry at Amnon, who he dealt with, but Absalom was angry at his dad. He was angry at his father. Absalom was a really outgoing, charismatic personality who was seemingly like a natural leader, and people were attracted to him. And so he was angry at his dad, and he got many followers, and they brought war, son on father. So Absalom and his army marched on Jerusalem, and David and his army fled east. And they fled across to the other side of the Jordan River, the east side that is, of course, and to the Jordan River. But David knew in his heart that resolution would have to come one day, and that resolution would be battle. And for David, that resolution, whether he won or lost, would be a loss. Because if he won, then Absalom would be exiled at best or murdered. And if David lost, he knew he'd be murdered. It's just the way things were. And sure enough, near the, I think it was the forest of Ephraim, the battle occurred, and we started to read a little bit about this battle. And in this battle, as we read, David was encouraged by his troops to stay back in the city and, wait out there because he was too valuable to lose in the heat of battle. As we read, like David said to his troops, just watch out for Absalom, my son. Make sure no harm comes to him in battle. Don't hurt him. So the battle raged. And David's army was victorious. Absalom was on a mule and fled the battlefield. He was seeking to escape. But as the scriptures remind us that, like, he had this long hair, like, a couple of our sons have had over the years, this long flowing hair. But for Absalom, maybe it was a bit longer than our boys, and it got caught in a tree as he was going under the tree on his mule, and his hair got caught. And so Absalom was suspended between, the sky and earth, hanging in this tree. And one of David's generals came, Joab. Remember, David said, watch out for my boy. Don't hurt my boy. Don't let your men hurt my boy. General Joab took 3 javelins and put them through Absalom's heart. And then the rest of his men did other stuff. Meanwhile, David's waiting back where he was waiting, and a first messenger came, and David could see that this messenger had good news. He was coming with a good news type demeanour about him, and basically, we won the battle. But what about Absalom? Any word on Absalom? And he really didn't give much of an answer. He said, it was all very confusing out there. And there was Joab and lots of confusion, I'm not quite sure. Another messenger was just behind him, and he came with the same good news that the battle was won. But David, what about my son Absalom? And this messenger basically said something like, may all your enemies die. And David knew that Absalom was no more. And David withdrew to the room above the city gate, I think it was, and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and cried out, "Absalom, my son, if only I had died instead of you." The legacy that David left was in many ways a legacy to be celebrated, but something that was maybe really, really, really important is not. If we look back in the scriptures to Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 down to 9 or 10, we see what the Jewish people call the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Right on the door frames, in every aspect of life, talk about me. And we see that that's maybe what David didn't do. We see that he, like most of us, we're busy. And I suspect David was busier than most of us. But the Word of God was saying, it's like, as families, make sure you talk about me in your everyday. And to do that, of course, you need to be there. So in our relationships with other people, we need to be there. In the legacy that we seek to leave with other people or leave with maybe our children, we need to be there. Like David wasn't there. He wasn't there when the little toys that maybe Absalom had broke, or Amnon. And so he wasn't there when they were older and their hearts were really struggling or maybe broken. He wasn't there. Like he hadn't built up the relationship when they were kids, and when they were older it was gone. And, ended up in murder. It ended up in war. For most of us, that wouldn't quite end up quite that severe, but you get the point. You've got to be there. David, when he was younger and at that point of his mid-40s, he sort of like turned his back on God for about a year, until eventually he came back to God. It seems like, however, that in that time, maybe Absalom turned his back on God as well. But when David came back, Absalom did not. So you've got to be there. You've got to be there if you're going to leave a legacy. And we also see in that little Shema in Deuteronomy, we see it's not only in your walk, talk about God and talk about the things of God. It's like the first part, as I mentioned before, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Someone said something like, something like this anyway, I think it was, the level of the family never rises above the level of the family devotion. I don't necessarily mean sitting around that dining room table saying prayers, but the level of the devotion there is to God. The scriptures just tell us. God's got to be near. God's got to be number one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. If that's a legacy you want to leave, then it's an example you have to give. You might love... I'm just trying to think of things that people maybe here don't love, rather they might think I'm pointing at them. You might love stamps. You might love space travel. You might, I don't know, most people like things. You might love these things. The things you love catch on. Like, how many kids love doing what their parents love doing? If you love God, it catches. So we talk about it, and it's more, as they say, it's more something that is caught rather than taught. Because it's the example that you give as the example that they follow. It's the thing or the who you love is often the thing or the who that they will love. So you might love stamps and love God. Well, I suspect, the younger ones might end up growing up to maybe love stamps. And I pray, love God. When Absalom was killed and David heard about it, and he went up to the room above the gate and cried and sobbed and cried out, he said, I would have died for Absalom. I would have died for Absalom. And I suspect most parents here would die for their children. If the need arose, many would. I've said it here before, but God probably will never call us to die for our kids, probably. But he always calls us to live for our kids. Let me pray. Heavenly Father,